Once we get the graphics from Voltaire and his army of interns, Mike and I go over storyboards and decide who is taking which shots and scenes. We try to break up the animation chores by dividing characters if possible, so the animation looks the same. The graphics we get come with a flat color layer. This is the color tone of the background for the scene, which the character will be in. Sometimes this presents a problem if a character is in a different environment, in which case we have to do some recutting on the characters. There can form a dark line around the character and it becomes apparent that he's been cut out from a photo.
I think Juliet is Voltaire's intern who cuts it all up into all the needed pieces. The eyeballs, the eye whites, the eyebrows, the head, the hands, sometimes right down to the finger joints. We need these to all be separate because in Flash we're animating them all on different layers.
All of the images within Chi-Chian are saved as GIFs at the highest image quality, then compressed further in Flash to decrease the file size. An interesting note is that we don't use transparent GIFs. Flash can import these, but what we've discovered is it bumps up the file size and leaves a lot of floating artifacts around the image. Instead, we import GIFs into Flash and cut the files up, trimming off the excess flat background color. We found after testing this method the image quality and crispness of the edges is much nicer. As an added bonus, the file size is a bit smaller for each graphic element. After cutting all the images up in Flash, we begin one of the most time-consuming processes, recompositing the character.
Once you've got all the pieces dropped into Flash, you have to be able to rotate them. For example, if you have the various pieces of an arm, you want the bicep to rotate on the shoulder, you want the forearm to rotate on the elbow, and you want the hand to rotate on the wrist. We cut out all the individual pieces, drop them into Flash, and then we have to change all of their centers of gravity. What happens here is that if you want an arm to swing in the correct way and your centers of gravity are off, you're going to have weird rotations where in a punch the hand sort of flies off and then reattaches at the end in an arc of motion. Not good.
Here is a finished character in a scene.
We have music that's written and performed by Voltaire, as well as a huge and talented voiceover cast. We did all of our sound record in one day, and then I actually got a whole stack of CDs with all of those sounds. When we're working on each episode, I take a rough edit of the sound, which is just the dialogue pieces which we need for one episode, and all of the sound effects from the sci-fi.com library that we can pull, and lay out just a rough sense of, the 2 or 3 minutes that one episode will take. I forward that over to Dan so that he and I can be working from the same sort of sound blueprint. It's important to have the sound down first for a couple of reasons. The first being that we have to do lip sync after the actors. Obviously, you don't want to have a speed racer like mouth just kind of opening and closing randomly while the voice is going over.
The animation we try to adhere to the soundtrack. We do need to deviate from it occasionally, but for the most part we don't move sounds around as there are 2 animators doing back-to-back shots. If we moved elements that impact a following shot, it could throw off the timing on the next guy's animation. So Mike would be pretty ticked off if, say, this sound flowed into his shot. Another thing to note about the sound is that we put those on layers as well. Here we have a music layer. Here's a voiceover layer, and a few effects layers.
Dan also has an additional duty in that he changes a lot of the sound effects.
We use sound editing software to make certain sound effects and add echoes, radio static, and things like that.
The actor who reads for Prochnarn, of course, gets actually no change to his voice. That's what he sounds like in the studio, because he's the man. The metaphor is kind of like writing in music. Like in Photoshop, you're working on a bunch of different layers, and each one of those layers represents the motions for one particular item in a character. It might be Chi-Chian's eyelids or Chi-Chian's eyebrows. When you look at all of those layers together, they're spread out across what is called a timeline, and it's like looking at the different instruments in a piece of music. Your job as a Flash animator is basically to set keyframes. You want to say where a particular piece or set of pieces, which is a character, will start moving and where it will stop moving, how far it will go, whether it will change in color, and whether or not the transparency is affected. This is basically how we do the entire series. although in traditional cell animation you have to draw every image from point A to point B, what Flash does is it allows you to drag all of the various all the various elements that you have from one position to another, and it will actually render all the in-betweens. That's why this is called tweening animation.
There are two types of tweens in Flash, motion and shape. In Chi-Chian we don't really use too many shape tweens. Chi-Chian is a bitmap-based animation, so there are no shapes really to tween. We do use vector art to a certain degree. The lighting, for instance, is drawn frame by frame, and is done using lines and curves created in Flash.
When you are working in claymation, and you have someone talking, for example, the Wallace and Gromit characters for Aardman animation, basically what they do is that every 1/8 or every 1/24 of a second, they are switching mouths from a closed mouth, if the character happens to be saying an or a b or a p sound, to an open mouth if they are speaking with a or a sound, or showing their teeth if they're grinning or saying some sort of e or n sound. That's called replacement mouths. And we do the same thing actually in Flash, only we have the advantage of drawing each of those mouths once and then writing in action commands so that as the mouth is moving around on the head, we can tell it at specific times to go to one specific keyframe and hold there. Over a course of 1 second, there will be 15 different frames, and if during that second, for example, Chi-Chian says, "Oh no!" then you put in the O mouth, and the O mouth, and the O mouth, and then the N mouth, and then the O mouth, and the O mouth, and the O mouth, and then you close it up. And that's basically how we go through all of our lip sync for every second in every minute of this series.
We use movie clips for a variety of reasons. They decrease your file size when used properly. They cut down on time by reusing complex sequences of animation as opposed to doing it over and over and over. You can also program them to make the movie clip do things you want for precise timing, and it makes things a lot easier when it comes down to editing as well.
I guess a major thing that we should discuss is also different animation styles. Voltaire is a real stickler and very proud of his style, which is a very smooth and natural movement. All of the cycles and all of the actions need to have an overlapping motion. What that means is that if you can give people a serpentine kind of flow in how they move, it makes things look a lot more realistic. You'd rather have that than sort of the jerky movements that you might have in the photographic drag a piece of paper across the front of South Park kind of style, which they do on purpose. We're just not looking for the same thing. Another part of that is the complex motions that we use for Chi-Chian's face. Chi-Chian's face is made up of about 15 different pieces. We have 2 eyebrows, 2 eyelids, the eyeballs themselves, the whites of her eyes hidden behind the mask of her face, as well as the 8 or 9 different replacement mouths. When we are trying to give her a sense of emotion, because a lot of the sequences are basically close-ups of Chi-Chian emoting, we have those elements to play with. If she's going to do a scene where she reads with some sort of rage, it's nice to sort of open the eyelids all the way, but drop the eyebrows.
I have a mirror here where I work, and people who come into my office say, "Are you that vain?" It's actually an old technique of finding certain facial expressions you might not know how to create. You strike the pose in the mirror, and then you try to animate what you see. You move the eyebrows when they move on your face, the nostrils flare at the right moment they flare, etc. That way you can change your face from expression to expression as your character does, and the movements will look natural and expressive. The final processes to the Chi-Chian episodes are the loaders, credits, file crunching, and compositing of Mike's half of the episode and mine. I designed the loaders to incorporate what is happening in the episode itself, and that way use some of the animations and graphics so that when the loader loads, it'll load some of those elements, meaning less time to wait to watch the actual movie. The credits are simply a sequence we cut and paste from previous episodes. It's sort of just like the movie credits. File crunching is something I do after I get Mike's animation, and a lot of that is my little secret. We composite Mike's and my own animation into one file, and thereby making the episode a whole animation. that's pretty much about it. I hope this wasn't too techy. Take it easy.
I know Dan said a nice sign-off. I was just going to say that, wow, I hate the sound of my own voice.